The air in Lajard and Celeste was heavy with the smell of expensive things. It was the smell of seared scallops, of truffle shavings falling like black snow onto pasta, of red wine so old it told stories. It was the smell of money, quiet and sure of itself. Elena moved through this air like a ghost. Her feet, insensible black shoes that were already beginning to pinch, knew every inch of the patterned carpet. Her hands, steady even when she was tired to her bones, carried worlds on silver trays. A world of foie gras, a world of champagne. Tonight, her world was heavy with the remains of a 5-course tasting menu. She was thinking about chords, not the musical kind, not right then, but the chords of her life. Rent was due in 9 days. The textbook for her next seminar cost more than she made in one shift here, and her professor's voice echoed in her head. Your analysis is competent, Elena, but where is the feeling? You write about music. Have you lived it? She felt the sting of it, a dull ache right behind her eyes. To live music required time, and time was the one thing she couldn't afford. It was eaten by shifts like this one, by the bus ride across town, by the hours spent copying sheet music in the library because she couldn't afford to print it. Her last table of the night was in the corner, the best spot in the house. It was where the soft light from the crystal chandeliers fell just right, and where you could see everyone but feel private. The man who sat there, the one who paid for the table to be kept empty unless he was in, was a regular. Everyone in the city knew his face from business magazines. He had built an empire from computer code and a ruthless idea. He believed most people sleepwalked through life, and he had no patience for sleepwalkers. Elena approached with the soup course. It was a delicate, emerald green pea veloute, a silent lake in a wide, white bowl. She focused, her mind a tight knot of concentration. Plate from the left. Don't interrupt the conversation. Lower smoothly. She was doing it all by the book, but as she leaned between two of his guests to place the bowl before him, her sleeve, a fraction too loose, brushed against the stem of his water glass. It was the lightest touch, a whisper of fabric on crystal. The glass didn't fall. It didn't even spill. It just shivered, letting out a tiny, clear ping dot. The conversation at the table stopped. The man's eyes, which had been fixed on a graph on his associate's tablet, flicked up. They didn't land on the soup, which was perfectly centered. They landed on the water glass, then on her sleeve, and finally on her face. It was a quick journey, and his expression didn't change much, but it cooled, like a screen going into power save mode. He didn't yell. His voice was calm, low, and it carried in the hushed room. Clumsy, he said. He wasn't talking to her. He was announcing it to the table, pointing out a flaw in a product. One of his guests, a woman in a sharp suit, offered a tight, complicit smile. Then he did something that made Elena's stomach tighten. He picked up his heavy linen napkin, pristine white, and with deliberate, slow strokes, he wiped the side of his water glass. There was nothing on it. It was a performance, a way of saying the very air around her was contaminating. He made sure she was watching, made sure his guests were watching. Before he dropped the napkin back onto his lap, "You have to be precise," he said, his gaze holding hers for a second too long. "In all things, perhaps you should stick to tasks that match your aptitude." He let the last word hang, a verdict. It meant she was built for carrying plates, not for handling fine things, not for being part of a world that demanded perfection. For Elena, the next few seconds were an exercise in stillness. A hot wave of shame rushed up her neck, into her cheeks. She wanted to look away, to stammer an apology, to disappear. But years of this work, of dealing with people who saw you as furniture, had built a wall inside her. She felt the emotion rise, hot and sharp, and then she pictured a box, a plain, gray, metal box. She took that feeling, that hot shame, and she put it in the box. She closed the lid. She locked it. Her face became smooth, neutral, a polite, professional mask. She gave the smallest of nods, not in agreement, but in receipt. A message received. "My apologies, sir. Enjoy your soup," she said, her voice flat and even. She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked back toward the service doors, her back straight, her pace steady. The eyes of the restaurant, which had subtly turned toward the scene, followed her for a moment before drifting away. Behind the swinging doors, the kitchen was a different universe, a noisy, steaming, chaotic relief. The chef was yelling about a steak. A dishwasher clattered racks. Here, she was just Elena, the quiet student who worked hard and didn't complain. She leaned against a cool stainless steel counter for just a second, closing her eyes. She could still hear the asterisk ping asterisk of the glass. She could still see the slow, dismissive wipe of that napkin. "Rough table?" asked one of the other waiters, a guy named Leo, as he flew past with a tray of desserts. "The corner," was all Elena said, and Leo whistled low in understanding. Everyone knew about the corner. She took a deep breath, pulling the smell of garlic and burnt butter into her lungs instead of truffles and judgment. She thought about the box in her mind, locked tight. Inside it, the shame was already changing, cooling, hardening into something else. A small, cold stone of anger. Not a hot, messy anger, but a quiet, focused one. She held onto it. For now, it was hers. She pushed off the counter and went to fetch the next course. The night wasn't over. There were still worlds to carry. Asterisk asterisk part 2 asterisk asterisk. The laughter from the corner table got louder as the night went on. It wasn't the happy kind of laughter you hear from friends having a good time. It was a sharp, barking sound. It was the sound of people who were used to winning, and who found the world, and everyone in it, to be a private joke they all understood. Elena kept her distance, managing her other tables with a quiet efficiency. She poured wine without spilling a drop. She cleared plates without a single clatter. She was a machine of perfect service. But inside, she was counting down the minutes. In her head, she was already on the bus, already walking up the steps to her small apartment, already opening her laptop to the dense, dry text of her dissertation. That was her real life. This room, with its crystal and its laughter, was just a painting she had to walk through for a few hours to afford the paint for her own. Finally, the signal came. The man in the corner raised his hand, not high, just a slight lift of the fingers. It was a king summoning a servant. She took a breath, smoothed her black apron, and went over. The table was a landscape of destruction. Crumpled linen napkins, half-empty glasses of port glowing like rubies in the low light, plates smeared with the last traces of a chocolate dessert that looked like abstract art. The conversation died down as she approached, for faces turned to her. The billionaire, his two associates, a man and a woman who looked like they were carved from the same sharp, expensive stone, and a younger guy who seemed to be hanging on every word, laughing a little too hard at every joke. "Let's settle the bill," the man said. His voice relaxed now, warmed by the food and the wine and the feeling of control. He didn't look at her as he said it. He was looking past her, toward the center of the dining room. And then his eyes stopped. They landed on the grand piano. It sat on a small, raised dais, a giant, elegant beast of polished ebony. It was beautiful, a masterpiece of furniture. But in all the time Elena had worked there, she had only ever seen it played a handful of times. A hired pianist on anniversary nights, his gentle jazz blending into the clink of cutlery. Mostly, it was just a thing to look at, a symbol of a culture the restaurant wanted you to think it had. A slow smile spread across the man's face. It was a different smile from before. This one was bright, amused by a new idea. He turned back to his guests. "You see that?" he said, nodding toward the piano. His voice was louder now, meant to be heard. "A beautiful instrument, a work of art, and what is it? A very expensive coat rack, a place for people to put their drinks when we have a crowd." His friends chuckled. "It's a shame, really. It requires a certain refinement to wake it up, a touch, a soul." He said the word soul with a little twist, like it was a silly, old-fashioned concept. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze to Elena. The smile was still there, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cool, calculating. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a tool, wondering what else it might be used for. "You," he said. The word hung in the air. "You've been very diligent tonight." It sounded like an insult. "Let's have a bit of fun." A final act. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, sleek and dark as a seal's skin, and pulled out a money clip. He peeled off a single bill. It was $100. He made a show of it, letting the crisp green paper catch the light. He placed it flat on the table, right in the middle of the crumbs and the stains, like a dare. "The piano," he said, his voice dripping with a fake, generous warmth. "Go on. Play us something, a tune. Anything simple will do." He leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands. "Consider it a tip. For the entertainment." The air at the table changed. His associates looked intrigued, their eyebrows raised. This was a new game. The young guy smirked, looking from the billionaire to Elena and back again. It was a perfect, cruel trap. If she refused, she was rude, ungrateful, confirming his belief that she had no spirit, no aptitude for anything beyond carrying plates. If she went up and fumbled through chopsticks or a halting children's song, she would be the night's joke, the waitress who thought she could perform. The laughter would be real then, and it would be at her. A silence spread out from the table. At nearby tables, conversations hiccuped and stopped. People sensed the drama. Forks were held in midair. They all looked at her. She could feel the weight of every stare, the curious, the pitying, the hungry for drama looks from the other diners. She saw Leo, frozen in the service doorway, a tray in his hands, his face a mask of horror. Elena looked down at the $100 bill. It was just paper, but it wasn't about the money. It was a ticket to be a clown in his private circus. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The cold stone of anger from earlier in the night began to heat up. It started to burn. She looked from the money to the piano. The great, silent, beautiful beast. It had been so long, a lifetime ago, it felt like. Her fingers, which now felt rough from carrying hot plates and washing glasses, tingled with a memory of smooth ivory, of weight behind a key, of the way a whole room could be held in the space between two notes. She didn't look at the man. She didn't look at his smirking friends. She looked only at the piano. And in that moment, the noise of the restaurant, the clinking, the murmuring, the oppressive weight of the expectation, all of it faded into a dull buzz. The only thing that was clear, that was real, was the path from where she stood to the stool in front of those black and white keys. Without a word, she moved. She didn't pick up the money. She didn't smile or nod or acknowledge the offer at all. She simply turned her back on the corner table and walked. Her sensible shoes were quiet on the carpet. She passed through the maze of tables, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead. The sea of faces blurred beside her. A part of her mind, the part that was still screaming, asked her what she was doing. This was madness. This was a bigger humiliation waiting to happen. But a bigger part, a part that had been locked in that gray box for years, was finally stretching its limbs. It was tired of being invisible, tired of being judged by the price of soup, tired of having her soul, her real soul, be a secret she only visited in library books and silent, longing thoughts. She reached the dais. She stepped up onto it. The piano was even more massive up close. She reached out and touched its lid. The wood was cool and impossibly smooth. She pulled out the stool. It was heavy. She adjusted its height by instinct, a movement her body remembered from thousands of repetitions in another life. She sat down. The room, now utterly silent, seemed to hold its breath. She laid her hands on the keys. They were cool. She didn't play a note yet. She just sat there, her eyes closed, feeling the familiar geometry under her fingertips, the hum of the air conditioning, the last whisper of a conversation from the bar. Everything fell away. Inside her, the chaos of the night, the shame, the anger, the years of quiet struggle, all of it began to swirl and organize itself. It was looking for a door out. She opened her eyes. She looked at her hands, then at the keys. And then, she began. The first sound wasn't music. It was the quiet sigh of the piano bench settling under her weight, a faint creak of wood and leather. It was the whisper of her sleeves against the polished wood as she brought her hands to the keys. Her fingers didn't hover. They rested, perfectly curved, a posture learned in a different world, a different lifetime. For 3 long seconds, there was only silence, a thick, expectant silence that seemed to press down on the whole room. Someone at the bar coughed, and it sounded like a gunshot. The man at the corner table kept his slight, superior smile. He was waiting for the first clumsy, childish note. This was the moment he'd paid for. Then, she moved. Her left hand descended, not with a tentative poke, but with a deliberate, solid weight. A low, thunderous chord rumbled through the silence. It wasn't a pretty sound. It was dark, ominous, a storm cloud forming in the low register of the piano. It vibrated in the floorboards, in the water glasses on the tables. Before that sound could fade, her right hand answered. A cascade of higher notes, sharp and clear like shattering ice, fell from her fingers. This was not chopsticks. This was not a simple tune. It was a language. A complex, furious, beautiful language that everyone in the room instantly understood on a level deeper than words. It was the sound of defiance. The smirk on the billionaire's face didn't just fade. It was erased. His eyebrows, which had been slightly raised in amusement, now drew together in pure, uncomprehending confusion. He leaned forward, as if the few inches closer would help his brain make sense of what his ears were hearing. This was impossible. This was a server in a black uniform. This was the woman who had brushed a glass. But the woman at the piano was gone. In her place was a conductor of storms. The piece built, layer upon layer. Her left hand marched a relentless, powerful rhythm, a heartbeat of something ancient and angry. Her right hand flew across the keys, weaving melodies that were at once heartbreakingly sad and fiercely proud. The music swelled, filling every corner of the opulent room. It chased out the smell of truffles and wine, replacing it with something electric, something alive. At her station by the kitchen door, Leo dropped his tray. It didn't clatter. He caught it against his leg at the last second, his eyes wide as saucers. He'd known she was a student, but he'd thought it was for history, or maybe literature. This was like finding out your quiet neighbor was a jet pilot, the Mactor D, a man who prided himself on the unflappable silence of his dining room, stood statue still by the reservation podium. His usual look of mild disapproval was gone, replaced by sheer awe. He wasn't hearing a performance. He was witnessing an event. At the corner table, the dynamic had shattered. The two sharp-suited associates were no longer looking at their boss for cues. They were transfixed by the figure on the dais. The younger man's smirk had vanished into a look of open-mouthed shock. He was a kid who'd been playing at being a tycoon, and now he was hearing what real power, real depth actually sounded like. It wasn't in a bank account. It was in those flying hands, and the billionaire. He was undergoing a quiet earthquake. The confidence that had propped him up, the absolute certainty of his place above everyone in the room, began to crack. He watched her, not with contempt anymore, but with a dawning, unsettling realization. He had tried to buy a moment of petty entertainment for $100. He had, instead, paid to have the scales torn from his eyes. He saw things now he had refused to see before. He saw the absolute focus on her face, a kind of serene intensity. He saw the muscles in her forearms, not from lifting trays, but from controlling this enormous instrument. He saw the way her whole body was part of the music, leaning into the fierce passages, pulling back for the moments of delicate sorrow. This was not a trick. This was a lifetime. This was thousands upon thousands of hours of lonely, difficult practice. This was a soul, poured out into sound. The music told a story, and against his will, he understood it. The thundering low notes were struggle, weight, the grind of something immense. The high, shining melodies were hope, fragile but insistent, fighting its way through. The crashing chords were anger, righteous and clean. And then, a passage of such profound, aching loneliness that it made the air feel thin. This was the sound of late nights, the sound of empty practice rooms, the sound of choosing something hard when something easy was right in front of you. He had humiliated her for a wobbling glass. He had reduced her to a function, and now, she was answering him with the full, glorious, complicated truth of who she was. She was answering him with a masterpiece. His cheeks, normally pale from office light, felt warm. A flush crept up his neck. It wasn't anger. It was shame. A hot, unfamiliar, choking shame. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He was pinned to his chair by the beauty and the brutality of it. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not the most powerful person in the room. The power was all up there, on that small stage, flowing from her fingertips. He glanced sideways at his associates. They weren't seeing his triumph. They were seeing her triumph. He was irrelevant. The thought was so alien it made his stomach tighten. On the days, Elena was nowhere else. The restaurant, the people, the man in the corner, they had all dissolved. There was only the map of the music in her mind and the instrument under her hands. Every ounce of the night's frustration, every silent complaint from her aching feet, every condescending word she'd ever swallowed, every doubting comment from a professor, all of it had a shape now. All of it had a sound. She gave it to the piano, and the piano gave it back to the room, transformed into something magnificent. She reached a furious climax, a whirlwind of notes so fast her hands were a blur. It was the sound of breaking free. And then, suddenly, it collapsed. The storm passed. The music became quiet, solemn, a series of deep, resonant chords that rang like distant bells. It was resolution. It was exhaustion. It was peace. The final chord hung in the air, a single, vibrating note that seemed to last forever. She held the pedal down, letting it fade slowly into absolute silence. She lifted her hands from the keys and placed them gently in her lap. She was breathing deeply, her shoulders rising and falling. She looked down at her own hands, as if surprised to find them there. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence was complete, heavier than before. It was the silence of an ending, and of a beginning. Then, from a table near the window, a single person began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Then another person joined, and another. It wasn't the polite applause that follows a hired pianist. It was louder. It was real. It built, table by table, into a wave of sound that filled the room. People were pushing their chairs back, standing up. There were even a few whistles. The staff, from the busboys to the sommelier, were applauding, their faces lit with pride and amazement. The spotlight of the room's attention, which the billionaire had so cruelly turned on her, was now hers completely, and it was no longer a harsh, exposing light. It was a warm, celebrating light. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply sat there for a few more seconds, collecting herself, coming back from that faraway place the music had taken her. Then, she stood up. She pushed the bench back under the piano with a soft scrape, and she turned to face the room. Her eyes, calm and clear now, found their way across the crowded space. They landed, inevitably, on the corner table, on the man who had set all of this in motion. He was not clapping. He was just sitting there, staring at her. All the color had drained from his face. His expression was unreadable. It was the look of a man whose world has just been quietly, thoroughly, turned upside down. He was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, completely and utterly speechless. The applause was a living thing. It wrapped around her, warm and buzzing, a complete opposite to the cold, quiet judgment of just a few minutes before. It was coming from everywhere. The older couple by the window, their faces soft with wonder. The group of friends celebrating a birthday. Their party hat suddenly silly in the face of this unexpected beauty. Even the kitchen staff had pushed through the swinging doors, their aprons stained with the night's work, their hands clapping with a sound like cracking thunder. For a few seconds, Elena stood there, letting it wash over her. The sound filled a hollow place inside her she hadn't even known was empty. It wasn't about pride, not exactly. It was a feeling of being seen, not as a server, or a student, or a person who made mistakes with water glasses, but as a person who contained whole worlds. It was a powerful, dizzying feeling. Then, the practical part of her mind, the part that knew her shift wasn't over, that there were still tables to bus and checks to run, clicked back on. The warmth of the applause began to feel like a spotlight that was getting too hot. She wasn't used to being the center of anything. She gave the room a small, awkward nod, more a duck of her head than a bow. It was a thank you, but also a please. That's enough. She stepped down from the dais. Her legs felt strange, both heavy and light, like she was walking through water. The crowd of her co-workers at the kitchen door parted for her, their faces split with huge grins. Leo reached out and gave her shoulder a quick, solid squeeze. You, he stammered, but he couldn't find the words. He just shook his head, his smile saying everything. She managed a small, tired smile back, but her path was set. She had to walk back to the corner table. There was no avoiding it. The bill was still there. The dirty dishes were still there. The man was still there. The room's attention followed her as she moved. The applause had died down to a murmur, then to that intense, listening quiet again. This was the second act of the drama, and everyone knew it. They watched her cross the floor. This young woman in a simple black uniform who had just held them all captive with a storm of music. As she walked, she could feel the energy of the piece still humming in her fingers. The ghost of the piano's keys was under her skin, but with each step, the real world came back into focus. The plush carpet, the gleam of silver on abandoned tables, the sharp, attentive eyes of the diners. She reached the corner. The scene was frozen. The two associates and the younger man were all looking at her now with a new, almost wary respect. The $100 bill was still there, a green island in the sea of white linen. It looked absurd now, pathetic, a toy offered to a giant. She didn't look at it. She didn't look at the man. She focused on the work. She reached for the empty port glass in front of the younger man. Her hand, which had just flown across the piano with fearless speed, was perfectly steady. The glass made no sound as she lifted it. It was only when she reached for the next glass, the one belonging to the woman associate, that he spoke. "Where did you?" The words came out of him, rough and quiet, like he had to push them through gravel. He didn't finish the question. He didn't know how to finish it. "Where did you learn that? Where did you come from? Where have you been hiding?" Elena paused, the glass in her hand. She finally looked at him. His face was pale. The easy, arrogant confidence was completely gone. In its place was a raw, unsettled confusion. He looked younger. He looked like someone who had just been given answers to questions he'd been asking all his life. only to realize he'd been asking the wrong questions entirely. She held his gaze. There was no anger in her eyes now. The music had taken it, burned it up as fuel for something else. What was left was a simple, clear exhaustion, and a deep, quiet certainty. The conservatory, she said. Her voice was calm, flat. It wasn't boastful. It was just a fact, as plain as stating the time. I'm finishing my doctorate. My dissertation is on Rachmaninoff. She said the composer's name not with flourish, but with the familiarity of someone who has lived with a person, in their head and their heart, for years. The name hung in the air. It meant nothing to some of the diners nearby, but to him, and to a few others, it was a key. It explained the storm, the sorrow, the technical fury. It was a name that stood for the pinnacle of difficulty, of emotional depth in music. A doctorate. He had been mocking a doctoral candidate. The absurdity of it was a physical weight in his stomach. She saw the understanding hit him, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible swallow. He looked down at the table, at his own clean hands, at the silly, untouched $100 bill. Elena didn't wait for more. She had answered him. There was nothing else to say. She turned back to her work. She gathered the rest of the dessert plates, stacking them neatly on her forearm with a practiced balance. She collected the crumpled napkins. She worked around the bill, leaving it right where it was. It was his problem now. The simple, mundane act of clearing a table had never seemed so powerful. It was a return to order, a statement. This is my job. That, a slight tilt of her head toward the piano, is my life. You don't get to mix them up unless I allow it. She turned with her full load of dishes and walked away, back toward the kitchen. The spell was broken. The room seemed to let out a collective breath it had been holding. Conversations started up again, but they were hushed, urgent, all about what had just happened. The story was already being woven, a legend for this place. In the hot, noisy sanctuary of the kitchen, the head chef, a large man with a permanently scowling face, was waiting for her. He took the stack of plates from her arms himself. He grunted. You wash nothing tonight. You stand. He pointed to a quiet corner near the lockers. You drink water. He snapped his fingers at one of the dishwashers, who scurried to get a bottle. It was the greatest honor he knew how to give. Elena didn't argue. She leaned against the cool metal locker, the bottle of water in her hand, and finally let the shaking come. It was a fine tremor, deep in her bones. It wasn't from nerves anymore. It was the crash after an immense effort, like a runner after a race, out in the dining room. The corner table was empty. The man and his party had left. She learned later from Leo that they had settled the bill in total silence. The man had paid with a black credit card, his face unreadable. He had left a tip that was, by any standard, obscenely large, and he had left the $100 bill sitting exactly where it was. A busboy had pocketed it with a shrug. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Other servers covered her tables. Patients she had served all night suddenly wanted to talk to her, to shake her hand, to ask her about music. She handled it with a shy politeness, but her mind was already drifting away, to the bus, to her apartment, to the quiet. When she finally stepped out the service entrance into the cool night air, the city felt different. The streetlights seemed softer. The noise of the traffic was just a rhythm. She felt drained, completely empty, but it was a clean emptiness, like a room that had been stuffed full of old, heavy furniture, and was now swept bare, ready for something new. She didn't know what would happen next. Maybe nothing. The man was powerful, but he was also proud. He might just want to forget this whole humiliating evening. That was fine. She had her answer. She had her music. She had, for a few minutes, been entirely and completely herself in front of a room full of strangers. It was terrifying. It was the most freeing thing she had ever done. She walked to her bus stop, the image of his speechless, pale face floating in her mind. She hadn't wanted to destroy him. She had just wanted to be whole. But in doing so, she realized she had shown him a piece of a world where his money, his power, his sneering judgments were just noise. And in the face of that kind of truth, there was nothing for a man like that to say. The bus arrived, its doors hissing open. She climbed on, found a seat in the back, and rested her head against the cool glass. Her fingers, resting on her knee, played a silent, repeating pattern on the fabric of her pants. A fragment of a melody, a ghost of the storm. She smiled, just a little, to herself in the dark, rattling bus. It was over, and it was just beginning. Elena slept later than she had in months, a deep, dreamless sleep that felt like sinking into a soft, dark hole. When she woke, The memory of the night before didn't hit her all at once. It came back in pieces. The feel of the cool piano keys, the silence before the first chord, the sea of stunned faces, and his face, last of all, pale and stripped of all its certainty. She made coffee in her small kitchen, the familiar ritual calming her. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a tender, almost bruised feeling. It was the feeling you get after telling a secret you've held for years. A relief and a vulnerability. She expected the world to feel different, but it didn't. The sun still came through her window at the same angle. The faucet still dripped if you didn't turn it off just right. Her dissertation notes were still spread across her tiny desk, a dense jungle of academic language that suddenly felt very far away from the living, breathing truth of the music she had played. She thought about the restaurant. She had a shift that evening. A part of her dreaded it. The stares, the questions, the weight of being the piano girl. But a bigger part knew she needed to go back. She needed to walk through that dining room as herself, as Elena the waitress, and prove that last night wasn't a fluke, wasn't a party trick. It was a part of her, but not the only part. Life, after all, was mostly about showing up and doing the work. She spent the afternoon trying to read, but the words wouldn't stick. Her mind kept replaying the music, not as a performance, but as a feeling. The clean, purging anger of it. It had been a message. But she realized now it was a message she had needed to hear herself as much as anyone else. You are still here. This is still yours. When it was time to get ready for work, she moved slowly. She put on the same black clothes, tied the same apron. She looked in the mirror and saw the same tired eyes, the same person. And that was okay. The walk to Le Jardin Céleste felt longer. She braced herself as she pushed open the service entrance. The kitchen noise hit her first, the same as always. But then, as she walked in, something shifted. The sous chef, a man who usually just grunted, gave her a sharp nod. The head chef, from across the room, raised his chin in acknowledgement. It wasn't a celebration. It was a silent, professional respect. They had seen one of their own do something extraordinary, and it had earned her a new kind of space. Leo grinned at her. Look who's here. The concert pianist. He said it lightly, teasing, but his eyes were kind. Just don't ask me to play and carry soup at the same time, she said, and the small joke broke the tension. It felt normal. Or, a new kind of normal. The dining room was quieter when she entered. It was early. A few tables were occupied. She felt eyes on her, curious glances, but they were softer than she'd feared. As she was refilling salt shakers, the maitre d' glided over. He was a man of perfect posture and even more perfect silence. A letter arrived for you, he said, his voice low. He held out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It looked expensive. It had her name, just her first name, written on it in a sharp, dark ink. No stamp. It had been hand-delivered. Her heart gave a single, hard thump. She knew, without opening it, who it was from. Thank you, she said, her voice dry. She took the envelope. It felt heavy. She didn't open it right away. She carried it with her, a secret weight in her apron pocket. Through the first hour of her shift, it felt like carrying a live wire. Every time she touched it, she thought of that cold, calculating stare turning into one of stunned shock. During a lull, she slipped out back to the alley where the dumpsters were, a place of grim privacy. The evening air was cool. She took out the envelope and carefully tore it open. Inside wasn't a letter, not really. There was a single sheet of the same heavy paper, and a business card, sleek and minimalist, embossed with just a name and a number. No company logo. The kind of card that said the name was the brand. The note was handwritten. The writing was precise, controlled, but the ink had bled in a few places, as if the pen had paused. It read, "An audience with the board of the National Arts Foundation is yours if you wish it. They meet next Thursday. A word from me, and they will listen. The piano at my residence is a Steinway D. It is tuned once a week. It is played never. It deserves an artist. MT." She read it 3 times. The noise of the city faded. There was no apology, no mention of the night before. No "I'm sorry I tried to humiliate you." It was something else entirely. It was an assessment. It was a transaction, but of a kind she'd never seen before. He wasn't offering her money. He was offering her influence. A direct line to one of the most powerful cultural funding bodies in the country. A chance to be heard by people who could change the trajectory of a career. And he was offering her an instrument, not as a gift, but as a duty. It deserves an artist. He was admitting, in his own sterile way, that she was one, and that he had something of value that was being wasted. It was a colossal offer. It was everything a struggling musician might dream of, a patron, a platform. And it made her skin crawl, because it was also a takeover. It was him seeing a problem, a wasted piano, a talented person serving soup and applying his fix. He was pulling her into his world, on his terms. He would become part of her story. The man who discovered the waitress, the benefactor. She leaned against the cool brick wall, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. This was the crossroads. One path was hard, lonely, and honest, scraping by on waitress wages, fighting for every scrap of academic recognition, playing on out-of-tune practice room pianos. The other path was smooth, fast, and carried the fingerprints of a man who had looked at her and seen a function, then an asset, but never quite a person. She thought of the music she had played, the Rachmaninoff. It wasn't just technical. It was about the human spirit grappling with immense forces, doubt, despair, hope. It was about finding your own voice in the noise. If she took this, whose voice would it be? After a long time, she folded the note neatly. She slipped it back into the envelope with the business card. She went back inside, finished her shift with a calm she didn't feel. The envelope burned in her pocket. At the end of the night, she didn't go straight home. She walked to the river that cut through the city. She stood on the bridge, watching the dark water move below, carrying reflections of lights. She took out the envelope. For a wild moment, she thought about tearing it up and letting the pieces flutter down into the water. A clean, dramatic end, but that wasn't her. She wasn't dramatic. She was deliberate. She put the envelope back in her pocket. She would not call the number on the card. Not to accept, not to refuse. To do either was to play the game by his rules. Instead, the next morning, she went to the public library. She used one of their computers. She found the publicly listed contact information for the National Arts Foundation. She wrote an email. It was brief, professional. It stated her name, her academic credentials, her area of research. It said she was a doctoral candidate exploring the emotional architecture of Rachmaninoff's later works, and that she understood the board was meeting soon. She asked, politely, if she might be considered for a few minutes to present her research proposal. She attached her CV. She did not mention a billionaire. She did not mention a restaurant. She hit send. It was a long shot, but it was her shot. As for the piano, the beautiful, silent Steinway D. She thought about that, too. A week later, she asked the head chef at the restaurant if she could come in on a Monday afternoon, when they were closed, to practice on the house piano. He shrugged and tossed her the keys. Just don't break it, he said. So, on Monday afternoons, in the empty, sunlit dining room, she played. Not for an audience, not for a patron, but for herself. The piano was good. Not perfect, but good. And it was hers in those hours. Free and clear. She never saw the billionaire again. But sometimes, when she was playing a particularly complex passage, working out a problem in her dissertation, or simply carrying a heavy tray, she would think of his offer. It wasn't a temptation anymore. It was a reminder that her value wasn't something for someone else to appraise and then fund. It was something she carried. It was in her hands, in her mind, in the quiet choice to do it her own way, one note, one step, one word at a time. Her life didn't become a fairy tale. Rent was still hard. The dissertation was still a mountain. But something had settled inside her, a peace. She had shown herself who she was, and she had decided, definitively, to trust that person. That was the real reward. Not a patron's favor, but her own. And that, she knew, was a kind of wealth no one could ever embarrass or take away.